Howdy Funkies. You know what I really dig? Banjos. They have that vibey little rhythm that can really strike up a real raucous party. Ding diddling diddling diddling. All the lads and lasses dancing and singing the night away, drinking their goof juice and just letting their hair down. Groovy, baby. But they're also more than capable of blasting those icy, melancholic, omen-like tunes that penetrate the flesh and shake the soul. Yes, banjos can do that. And if you don't believe me, go and grab your handkerchief, pull out your knives and forks, and open wide for a big, chunky piece of humble pie. Yeah, now don't you feel like a silly Billy? And if you never doubted me, thanks mate, high five. However, I'm not here today to slag or praise you based on your banjo knowledge, no siree, but rather to discuss a film that uses this funky little guitar to set the mood in a story that's just as disturbing as its music. This flick is The Power of the Dog, a movie about cows and horses. No. It's an unsettling tale set in 1925 Montana that focuses on two ranch-owning brothers, one of their wives and her adulting son. The story is loaded with secrets, hidden meanings, symbolism, as well as a few forms of betrayal. The overall dynamics in this movie are really freaky, but are they well executed? So, without further ado, get comfy, go and grab your popcorn, for I will dive into this film and dig up as much content as I possibly can, and hope that it's enough to conclude your pursuit for answers. And if you dig this video, please like and subscribe and hit the little notification bell so you get a ring-a-ding-ding each time I upload. With that being said, a spoiler warning is now in effect. Haven't watched the movie? Get out of here! And please come back afterwards. Right, let's get odd! Now, the film begins with a short narration by a young, soft-spoken male stating that he wishes for his mother's happiness following the death of his father, and to not help or save her would be shameful. This opening line carries major significance as it is essentially the heart of the film, and I'll discuss this later. We are then introduced to our two ranchin' brothers, Phil and George Burbank, played by Benedict Cumberbatch and Jesse Plemons. During the cattle drive, another seemingly minor event pops up as Phil instructs his cowhands to keep his cattle away from a dead cow that has died from anthrax. But this too carries importance in keeping with the theme of the film. Shortly after, Phil mentions Bronco Henry to George, a recurring name and important figure, albeit unseen. It is made clear that the two brothers have a rather strained relationship and find it difficult to communicate and connect. This too adds gravity to the plot. Watching this back, it's actually fascinating to see how much weighty content there was within the few minutes without actually giving anything away. For a slow burn movie, it's actually chock-a-block with under the surface action from the get-go. But let's get back to the movie. Next scene, we meet widowed inn owner Rose, Kirsten Dunst's character, and her peculiar but fatherless boy, Peter, played by Nanny McPhee's grandson, Cody Smith McPhee. Sorry. They begin to prepare the inn for our two brothers and their cowboys. In the meantime, George turns down a shot from Phil which really rattles him, as he wanted to drink to the memory of Bronco Henry, who we now learn was a mentor to the two brothers, except Phil seems to be more influenced by him than George. Phil also seems to be much more respected by his men than George is, despite both of them being in charge. In the dining hall, Phil scopes out the room and establishes himself as the big bad, mocking Peter for his effeminate nature and his lisp. We see a further disconnect between the two brothers as Phil and his boys laugh away at Peter's expense, while George appears ashamed and unimpressed. Phil then relives a memory of Bronco Henry, glorifying him in the process. He tries to include George, but he is so disengaged that he actually has no clue what Phil is even talking about, and the big boss is rather frustrated. The cowboys head out after dinner, with all except for George leaving. Instead, he stays behind and comforts Rose, who is rather distressed at how unnerved Peter was. At the saloon, all the men and women mingle, sing and dance, except for Phil, who instead quietly sips his whiskey. I think it's whiskey, what else did cowboys drink in those days? Before hitting the hay. George enters later and confronts Phil on his treatment of Peter, albeit in a rather tame manner. Fast forward a little bit and we are back on the ranch, where Phil stands with his cattlemen and quietly observes the mountains. They ask him what he sees and if anyone else has seen it, before he gives a cryptic response that leaves this guy as puzzled as Nick Young. However, what Phil says isn't mumbo jumbo, and it will make sense later on. Georgie boy heads out in the hoopty to give Rose a surprise visit and kindly helps her out by adopting the role as waiter, which takes everyone by surprise considering his status. Aw, what a romantic lad. George arrives back at his ranch that evening and Phil tries to converse and reminisce with him, but they still struggle to connect, and the gap between them continues to grow. George later reveals to Phil that he has in fact married Rose.
Come again?
Who will be joining them at the ranch while Peter attends college. I guess Phil saw that coming. George reveals that he has arranged a dinner with his parents and the governor, and would like for Rose to play something on the piano. Our newlyweds stop by the countryside for a cuppa and a quick dance, and an emotional George expresses how wonderful it is to not be alone, and more so, loved. Back at the ranch, Phil gives Rose an ice-cold greeting and accuses her of being a gold digger.
Now I ain't saying she a gold digger, but she ain't messing with no broke
Cowboys. She ain't messing with no broke cowboys. But on a serious note, it is here that we begin to understand the dynamics a little bit more. Phil becomes emotional when realizing that George is happy with Rose and listening to the two giggle away, because he's actually jealous. As much of a hard time he gives George, he actually desperately wants his affection and to connect with him. Phil is just as lonely as George was prior to meeting Rose. However, his toxic behavior and outlook is what ultimately prevents him from truly connecting with George. The two are indifferent, and whenever George is unable to relate to Phil, he blows up and masks his hurt beneath a facade of domineering bravado. But where does this indifference stem from? Let's return to the film and find out. Phil heads into the barn to clear his mind and picks up Bronco Henry's saddle, which he cleans in a very intimate and personal manner. This should definitely raise a few eyebrows, but let's carry on. Phil later enters a natural and secluded enclosure, which could potentially carry more symbolism, and strips naked before getting muddy and taking a bath in the natural waters. Oh, Benedict, you naughty boy. I can see your bum. You know, watching this scene, I thought I recognized this girl, but I couldn't place my finger on it. George gifts Rose with the piano for the dinner that he has arranged with his parents and the governor. Now, I'm no piano expert, but based on their interaction, this is a pretty top-notch model. Rose, already stressed, thanks George, attempts to practice for a big evening, but Phil engages in a standoff, matching her rhythm on the piano to that of his banjo, before completely outshining her, commencing his psychological onslaught. A few moments later, George cuts Phil deep as he musters up the courage to ask that he washes up before dinner, which later prompts Phil not to join. Okay, now I know that I said these two had a strained relationship, but holy smokes, the volatility here must be sky high for this plain and simple request to be A, so unnerving to ask, and B, so insulting that it paralyzes you. So if the shakiness of this brotherhood was not yet highlighted, it should now be sticking out like a sore thumb. Speaking of sore thumbs, have a look at Rose here, who is now in the company of her in-laws, the governor, and his missus. Yikes. Yeah, Georgie boy really blindsided her with this visit, although he doesn't look too comfy himself, I must say. Another interesting detail here is how, in George's absence, his pretentious mother refuses to accept a drink that he made. I'm not 100% sure, but this could allude to a tense relationship with his mother, maybe even one where Phil is favoured, potentially adding to the animosity between the two brothers. Anywho, later at the dinner party, is this a party? I don't know if I can actually call it that. Rose is unwillingly pressured by the lot to play piano, in which she fails to execute due to her rocketing anxiety of the situation. You need some pretty big grapes to watch the scene, because man, is it awkward. The evening is made even more tense as a stinky Phil comes waltzing in to antagonize the guests, particularly Rose, who he mocks and humiliates in front of the guests. This traumatizes her so much so that she immediately turns to drink, something that she was previously opposed to. Also, I don't know if this is just Kirsten Dunst's face, because she always looks like she's about to burst into tears, but here she seems genuinely terrified of Phil. It is way beyond just uncomfortable or unnerved, and understanding the true nature of their relationship is vital to the story. Now we enter chapter 4, and Peter joins Rose on the farm for summer break. Upon arriving, he is immediately taunted by Phil and his men. Rose's drinking habit has worsened, and Peter discovers that she has now turned to booze upon finding her intoxicated, or hungover, I'm actually not too sure, with a bottle of bourbon beneath her pillow. In this encounter, Peter reveals he made a trap and surprises Rose with a cute little bunny rabbit. And then he guts it, like a few minutes later. This guy is a weirdy malarity. She knows what I'm talking about. But his reason for slicing it open is actually for medical purposes. So at least he wasn't, I don't know, eating it. Also, I only realized in this scene that the young housekeeper is Thomasin Mackenzie, the protagonist from my previous video last night in Soho. I promise you that this is just a fatco inky dink. I'm not going on a Thomasin Mackenzie spree. Anyways, back to the film. Here, mother and son head outside and play cowboy tennis. Whoa, check out that view. I want to be a child of the wild. A wild child, if you will. But Rose resigns as the alcoholic effects take over and vomits up some bile. Meanwhile, Phil adds another piece to his stone collection. What? Does anyone know if this scene carries any significance, or does he just go about randomly collecting rocks? Phil now discovers Rose chugging that fire water out back and whistles away melodically but keeping out of sight, intensifying the psychological torment. Later, Phil heads into the wilderness and does some tai chi with his handkerchief before intimately embracing it. A peculiar scene, but look closely and you'll see the initials BH embroidered in the cloth. BH as in Bronco Henry. Remember the earlier scene with Phil caressing that saddle? Yeah. This element brings into light the question of Phil's sexuality as well as his relationship with Bronco Henry. We can do a little more than speculate at this point, but there's more content to dig up, so let's continue. So Sheriff Pete over here finds Phil's secret hideout, accidentally I presume, and stumbles upon a box belonging to Bronco Henry with magazines depicting nude and muscular men. Now, I see other reviews saying that this scene reveals that Bronco Henry was gay, but I feel like that's jumping the gun, at least for now. Amidst the magazines of men, there was also one with a woman. Furthermore, it's not like he picked up a porno mag. It was a fitness issue with the top reading, "Weakness a crime, don't be criminal." However, there could be a double meaning here. This doesn't necessarily prove in itself that Bronco was gay. It could have simply been a magazine issue on fitness and how to look manly. But it could also be symbolic of Bronco and Phil masking their true nature, or to them their weakness, behind a facade of false bravado. However, I don't believe that this is necessarily concrete evidence for anything, but rather symbolism. Pete sees Phil bathing in the natural waters with the infamous handkerchief before Phil spots him and chases him away. Chapter 5 kicks off and we appear to be at a camp of sorts, when bizarrely Phil shows some decency towards Pete and shows him a rope that he's making, of which he intends on handing over to Pete as a gift. Why the change in attitude towards Pete, I'm not too sure. There are only 3 options really. 1, another tactic to unsettle Rose. 2, Phil is concerned Pete has discovered his true nature and has to compensate to save his reputation. Or 3, it is a genuine attempt to connect to Pete. The last 2 seem unlikely to me. Phil was unaware that Pete had stumbled onto his forbidden stash and saw anything that might jeopardize his character, unless he assumes that Pete saw more than he actually did and is just taking precautions. And concerning being genuine to Pete in a change of heart, I don't see that. Needless to say, Rose's alarm bells start ringing. Phil continues to interact with Peter, even letting him sit on his beloved Bronco Henry's saddle. In a discussion concerning old Bronco, Phil asks Pete what he thinks he saw when staring at the mountain, the same mountain from before that perplexed Phil's men. And Pete responds with a barking dog, as the mountain casts a shadow that takes said form. This hits Bill like This hits Bill like a bombshell, as he's taken aback by Pete's observation. Back inside, an inebriated Rose gets philosophical with Pete, just like me when I've had one tot too many, or actually, just me whenever, lol, and speaks about being unreachable. I assume that this has to do with Pete being such a distant and odd little boy. She then speaks about how the sound of chalk on a chalkboard would make her shiver, but the meaning is more ominous as she's actually contrasting that sound to that of Phil's voice, or more so his presence. Pete tells her that she doesn't have to do this and that he will aid her. I presume that he is referring to her drinking. Phil teaches Peter to ride before he heads out into the wilderness on his own, for reasons unknown to anyone, including the audience. After nearly falling on his noggin, Pete comes across a dead cow and gets surgical, pulling out his scalpel and cutting its hide. Later, a panicked Rose watches as Phil and Pete ride off together, and she expresses to clueless George here her distaste for the situation. The two arrive at a quiet location and Phil begins building a fence and tells Peter that the famous Bronco Henry only started riding at around the same age as Pete. Now this may seem insignificant, but it shows that Phil is beginning to truly change his perspective on Pete, as he's making comparisons, regardless of how small, to this idolic figure in his life. Phil tries to extract the rabbit from the woodpile but ends up with a gash on his hand, and so Pete takes over and lures the injured rabbit to him, caressing and sheltering it before breaking its neck. This is a very telling scene that can be referenced later, as it gives insight into our characters as well as the plot. In the next scene, which is also hefty in mnemonics, can I say that? Phil tries to paint Rose as a hindrance in Peter's life and implies that his late father was probably an alcoholic because of her. Pete opens up to Phil about his father's death and says that his dad believed he was too strong, a statement that Phil ridicules. However, Phil took this in the literal sense, whereas the implication refers to Peter's spirit, not his stature. The meaning here will later come into light. Back at the ranch, the angry Mrs. Lewis dismisses 2 Native Americans in search of hides, of which Phil has plenty but apparently intends on burning just so that nobody else has access to them. A bitter Rose chases after them and pleads with the 2 lads to come back and take the hides. They give thanks by gifting her with a set of gloves, which deeply touches her. She waddles off and, very unconvincingly I have to say, faints. Probably from alcohol poisoning. I think Kirsten could have tried a little harder to sell this, but I don't know, maybe I'm being too critical. Georgie boy comes to the rescue and carries her up the stairs like Prince Charming. And say what you want about old Chunky over here, but this dude got some power to carry that dead weight. You go, George! Phil and Pete arrive back at the ranch, and Phil just about peaks at around nuclear warhead level. I would say he's about as volatile as an Angry Jules in Pulp Fiction.
Well, I'm a mushroom cloud laying motherfucker.
Excuse the language. So, Phil is overly emotional about Rose giving the hides away. Not just angry. This clearly seems to have some sort of deep impact on him. But hey, look at that! It's Pete to the rescue! As he offers Phil his portion of rawhide from earlier. You know, that bit that he scooped up from that rotting cow. Phil is touched by this act of kindness and embraces Pete as he promises to finish the rope by the next day. But why is he so adamant on this? Just bear with me a little longer, we're almost there. So the two continue to bond as Phil keeps working on said rope and says that Bronco Henry was more than his best friend, as he recalls a memory where old Bronco saved his life by using their body heat to keep warm in freezing weather. Pete asks if they were nakey, to which Phil responds with an awkward chuckle. This insinuates that they were, and Pete is aware of it. Things get a bit tense for the viewers as the 2 weirdies here lock eyes and amorously share a cigarette. This scene confirms a lot, namely that A. Phil is indeed gay, B. His relationship with Bronco Henry was more than platonic, and C. Pete reminds him somewhat of Bronco, which is why he's so adamant on giving him this rope. He is doing it as if it were for his lover, or so to speak. It's a very disturbing scene, especially considering that Bronco was much older than Phil, indicating that he was perverted and potentially even a pedophile. Yet, because he was such a dominant figure in Phil's life, Phil has been shaped by his experiences, teachings, and encounters with Bronco, despite its obvious toxicity. This is probably also why Phil and George have been impacted in such different ways, and why George is much softer than Phil, because he lacked that closeness to Bronco, and maybe even saw him for what he truly was. Although George's intuition is very questionable, especially considering how clueless he is throughout most of the movie. The next day, George discovers that Phil is ill. Bars, and they get ready for a doctor's visit. A delirious and befuddled Phil looks for Pete to give him the finished lasso, but he's unable to find him and George gets him into the car. Just a few moments later, as quickly as an apple drops from a tree, Phil dies. The doctor is unsure but assumes it to be anthrax. George is taken aback by this as he states that Phil was very particular about not dealing with infected animals. But he was blinded by rage and lust when he accepted Pete's grotesque strips of hide and mingled his open wound in that filthy, anthrax-polluted water. So that's how he bit the dust. Next scene, Phil's funeral takes place and Peter is absent. Instead, he remained at the farm and reads through a book of common prayer, a liturgical book used in Anglican communion, and comes across Psalms chapter 22 verse 20, which reads, "Deliver my soul from the sword, my darling from the power of the dog." So what is this movie trying to say? Well, in the very next scene, George arrives back with Rose that evening and the two embrace one another, as Peter looks on with a sinister smile on his face. Fascinating. And cut. So that's how the movie concludes, and Peter is clearly happy with Phil's demise. But why? Were they not just bonding? Well, not really. If the movie hadn't made it clear enough, Peter is an odd little man. Take note of how the film starts. An unknown narrator speaks of saving his mother before introducing us to Phil and George. The narrator was Peter, and that starting statement was essentially the plot for the film. The story isn't actually about Phil or George, but rather about Peter and his desire to help his mother. Phil tormented Rose from the outset, and as such Peter retaliates. And as skilled a tactician as Phil was, Peter was the mastermind. Essentially, he manipulated Phil the moment the opportunity presented itself, and he established himself as a friend before blindsiding him and indirectly killing him. Or directly, I suppose an argument could be made for that. These hints were dropped throughout the film. Take the scene where Phil cuts himself. Peter is studying to be a surgeon, and is clearly knowledgeable on wounds, diseases, gashes, you name it. However, although he consoles Phil, he never offers to help him despite more than likely knowing how to. And then ultimately delivering the final blow by giving him the strips of diseased hide, knowing full well that it could infect Phil's wounded hand. It was Peter's aim to bring harm upon Phil. There is also interesting symbolism throughout the film. Take a look at how, when trying to catch the rabbit here, Peter lures it into a false sense of security before killing it. The rabbit is contrasted to Phil, as Peter does the exact same thing with him by getting close and making him feel secure, even vulnerable, only to pull the rug from beneath his feet and off him when he has the chance. Their final night together was the peak of Peter's manipulation, as he exposes Phil's nature and makes him vulnerable before playing on his sexuality and using his relationship with Bronco Henry as a blueprint to convince him of a false narrative. Let's refer to the scene where Peter speaks about his dad saying that he was too strong and not kind enough, to Phil's bewilderment. This is indicative of things to come, as Pete mentally outmuscles Phil and plays on his weaknesses. As rough, rugged, and unpleasant as Phil is, he was actually the prey in this tale, and in more than one way. Let's look at Phil's character quickly. I feel like the natural enclosure was symbolic of Phil himself, as outside the enclosure, he's hard, intolerable, and no nonsense. But inside, where almost nobody can see, he's vulnerable and his true nature is clear. Phil is a closeted homosexual who overcompensates for his insecurities by wearing a mask of false machismo, just like Bronco Henry. And we know this from the reputation that Bronco has, as well as the symbolism discussed earlier regarding his hidden stash. Furthermore, the true antagonist of this film is Bronco Henry, as he preyed on and manipulated a young Phil, which shaped him into the man that he was, with the perspective he inherited. We learn through revelation. And Bronco created the monster within Phil. So Phil was a victim to Bronco's abuse as much as he was prey to Peter. This really is a tragic aspect of the story, considering that Phil is not a likable character, but he is very much human. This creates quite a confrontational dynamic, at least in my perspective. We have our protagonist, Peter, who has noble intentions, but does not have a very relatable or even a likable character, showing himself to be cold and methodical, exhibiting almost sociopathic behavior. Even with Rose, the one person that he truly loves, he's not very expressive or warm towards her. And then we have what is supposed to be our antagonist, with a truly tragic backstory who carries major baggage and trauma and shows his hurt the most. This dynamic brings us to the verse from Psalms in the end, which is also the title of the movie. So who is the verse referring to in the film? Is it referring to Pete and his mother asking for deliverance, with the dog being Phil? Or is it the other way around, with Peter being the dog? Honestly, I think it's up to interpretation, and an argument could be made either way. It depends on how you view the film. I think it's supposed to be divisive, and I don't know how I feel about that. This film conveniently reminds me of a saying by Mark Twain. It's not the size of the dog in the fight, but the size of the fight in the dog. This is true in the outcome of the film, and I felt like it was hinted to in the scene where Peter was mocked for being reputed as too strong. Overall, I really enjoyed the film. There are certainly a few questions that were left unanswered, such as why Pete cut the hide off of that diseased cow in the first place and what he intended to do with it, because there was no way of him knowing that the events would unfold in the way that they did, and creating the opportunity for him to use it to infect Phil. Remember, he did this before Phil cut his hand open and without the knowledge that his mother was going to give the hides away. It was just completely random, yet it was essential to Phil's downfall. Also, what was Phil doing with that rock collection? I still don't know. Someone help me. On the odometer, I will give The Power of the Dog an 8 out of 10. Whoa! Good score! I feel like there was something more I was supposed to add, but what's the bet? I'll only remember after I upload the video. Silly little me. So, I think that pretty much wraps it all up. And if you were kind enough to stick around for this long, please let it be known that I truly appreciate it. I do, very much so. If any of you feel like there is something to add, please don't be shy. Be a darling and drop your thoughts in the comments below. And of course, if you haven't already liked and subscribed to the channel, please make a little old oddball like myself a happy chappy and do it. Also, if there are any suggestions for reviews that you would like to see, let me know. Wink wink, nudge nudge. Alrighty, thanks funkies. Catch you later. Adios.